Welcome back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. Our guest this week is no stranger to the podcast and probably no stranger to you. In fact, the episode that she and I did on Zone 2 training is the most listened to and most downloaded podcast that we have had since we first started the podcast altogether. She joined us again to talk about high altitude training and then a third time to talk about goal setting in the new year. And she is on again, this time for the fourth time, to talk about some writings that she's recently been doing for her own blog called Coaches Confidential. There was one article in particular that caught my eye based off of some comments that she had made about not being married to the data on your watch, and maybe most controversial in the eyes of many is that your actual heart rate itself doesn't matter. Now, there's way more context to this than what it sounds like on the surface, which is exactly what our podcast is about. So she and I chat about that, as well as particularly 3 articles that she's recently written and putting in the Coach Confidential, which I would highly encourage you to go down to the show notes, find, click on, and take a read for yourself. They're all fairly brief, but really good, really basic, and get you down to the nuts and bolts of what you really need to know. So we cover that and a host of other topics in this episode, and I hope that you enjoy it. If you are curious about anything that we talk about, or you are wanting to check out some of the articles that she's written or past podcasts that she has been on, you can press pause, go check those out, and then come back to this one when you get done. But when you're ready, here's our conversation together. We have quite a few new people who listen, so I think a good place is just a brief introduction to who you are and what you do, what you like to do, and your roll it uphill athlete, and then we'll kind of dive into it.
Who am I? That's a good question, Kyle. Lots of things. I am, among many things, I am director of coaching at Uphill Athlete. So that's a coaching company dedicated to working with exactly that uphill athletes. So we work with mountaineers and climbers and multi-day adventure folks. We work with trail runners. We work with dirt bikers. We work with backcountry hunters. So any sort of person that likes to play or challenge themselves in the mountains, that's our happy place. And those are the people that we like to work with.
And you have your own like personal interest and niche. Like you're pretty, I don't want to say, I guess accredited. This might not be the right word, but like you do quite a bit of events yourself and are an athlete yourself as well.
Yeah, I like to do all the silly things too. From a professional background, I am a exercise physiologist, and I did some targeted work in my graduate studies on sort of extreme environments, so high altitude, high heat, cold, that sort of thing, to help understand how the body can best function under those extreme conditions. And I wanted to learn more about that too, because for myself, when I was once upon a time um, trying to compete as a trail runner, and there wasn't really anyone that knew how to help me do better in those environments. And now, over time, thankfully, there's a little bit more information out there, but still, I feel like the information that's out there is a little bit messy. And so I'm happy to have opportunities like this to talk about some of these topics and help simplify things for people.
Yeah, and so you've been on with us, like I think this is the fourth time that you've been on with us, and so I'll link all 3 of those because in each episode was different, and each episode you were gracious enough to spend a fair chunk of time talking about different topics, one of them being altitude and, that kind of being your specialty, one of them talking about the ever popular Zone 2, and then one of them about goal setting, and this one will be, kind of a roundabout summary of those things and revisiting those things as well, but I'll link all of those for people who aren't familiar, and so you and I have swapped some like research studies over the years because we're both science nerds on that front. But you've also started I don't want to call it, what would you call it? I don't want to do a disservice by calling it something you don't want it to be called, but it's under the Substack. But what would you call it? Your thoughts, a blog, or
Yeah, it's kind of both. Some people are starting to call it the Dear Abby. the Dear Abby for
Yeah.
or over 40 athletes. So the this kind of came out of this me being a little bit, and you and I have exchanged some information and conversations, Kyle, about just the misinformation and the volume of misinformation and how it's just seems so complicated for people and there's not a lot of good practical advice which you dedicate yourself to. I dedicate myself to. But when I'm working with people just one on one, I can't really disseminate that in a big way. And certainly I do write articles for the Uphill Athlete website and do podcasts there. But I wanted to give people an opportunity to ask their specific questions. And I'm not the biggest Instagram person the way you are with your Ask Me Anythings. So I thought this would be kind of a fun way where people could confidentially write to me with questions about training for whatever sport it was, and I would answer them. And it's been really, I've chosen to do that over Substack, and it's been really fun to see the kinds of questions that are coming in and the sorts of feedback that I'm getting.
Yeah, and it like the word that I when I read them and I'm not putting words in your mouth. I'm saying like my interpretation is the frustration side of coaching. And it's not the frustration that you have in work. If I'm wrong, you jump in and tell me. It's not the frustration that you or I would have in working with the athlete or working with the client. It really seems like for both of us, and I'm a little bit putting words in your mouth here, I guess, so I apologize. It seems like the frustration is with the industry or with culture or with social media projecting or painting this picture of fitness, of nutrition, of training, or as you've written about and we're going to talk about here with zone 2 that has made people who want to do well believe they've got to fall into the specific mold to do anything really.
Yeah, it's really tough, right? Because I think a lot of these training principles, nutrition is another great example. People kind of fall into these culty cliques, right? I'm going to eat paleo. I'm going to do this. This is going to be the magic thing that's going to move things along, or I've got to track this metric, or I've got to do this one thing. And I think that the challenge with this sort of, I don't know, what would we call it? Optimization culture, right? It's telling people that your problem or your discomfort is a data problem. If you just ate this way, if you just did this workout, your whole life would change. And if you're confused, just track more stuff. If you're tired, look at your HRV, fix that. And so people don't have a information deficit. It's kind of a trust deficit. They don't really know who to trust, or they're trusting a source that maybe isn't particularly trustworthy. And what they don't trust is themselves and their own instincts. And so probably what I do a lot of and you do a lot of is breaking that down and trying to find the source and deprogram some of these things for people.
So you have been coaching for a very long time, and like we talked about, you've had an interest in it even longer just through yourself. Why, I guess maybe a twofold question would be when and why did we all of a sudden become so not trusting of ourselves and what we feel and feeling like we needed to be married to wearables, data, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think this little shift probably happened a little bit over time. You know, you can think back to when, I don't know, if I think about when did it start happening? Did it start happening when Fitbit became popular and people started talking about steps? Got to get my steps in, got to get my 10,000 steps. Why 10,000? Don't know. They say I need to get 10,000 steps, or this gadget I got for Christmas says I need 10,000 steps. I got to get up and move around. So is that inherently bad? No. If someone was completely sedentary and their Fitbit that they got from their brother make them move around more and be conscious of how little they were moving throughout the day, really important shift. But it's important also to think about when we start doing something new, what's the reason we're doing it? Where does that number or that prescription come from? And how does it matter for you in your life, in your particular situation? And then we've added on to that now, right? We've got people tracking HRV, tracking sleep, tracking their heart rate when they're exercising. And doing that is not inherently bad. Those metrics are really important. But when people are trying to follow or trying to follow some particular target and they don't know why they're following that target and they're not even asking the question about why they're following that target. That's where there's a problem because it might not be the thing that is going to be most important for them.
So what are the articles that you wrote and that I like initially I've read every one since because it's so good. All of
Oh,
them are
thank
so
you.
good. And I will be sure to definitely link that in the show notes. I think it's I mean I think you've written maybe a total of seven, six or seven, published them on Substack.
That's probably right. Yeah, I started it just a few months back.
So there's a handful. I mean, I've read them all, but there are three in particular in there that if a person was starting out on this journey of trying to discover zone two, etc., I would tell them to start there before they ever get into the specifics of zone two because it's such basic and practical information. But the one that I want to ask you about the most, and the one that I initially reached out and have since read the others, was the one called The Cult of Zone Two. Right.
Hmm.
So the I want to sort of start from the beginning of that article where you go through and you mentioned that this idea of zone 2 is now built around a cult, and the cult thinking is that everything you should be doing should be driven by this magical heart rate zone. And I think the idea among most people is that if they go 1 beat per minute on either side of this zone, the workout is wasted. They've not achieved anything. They can't trust themselves, and therefore they become married to the watch. Why is that thinking true or untrue? And I guess the natural question that would precipitate out of that is if it's untrue or if it's true, what should we be doing instead?
Yeah. Oof. We could talk for a long
I
time on
know.
this topic, couldn't we? I think that the main thing is for people to think about is that zone two is not a number. Zone two is not a specific number that you should be targeting. Zone two, we talk about that as a training zone. And when I say it's not a number, it's because it's a representation of your metabolic state. So if we think about from a scientific perspective, and I don't want to go too deep on this to lose anybody, um, but it's really the highest intensity that your body can be working while it's still maintaining metabolic equilibrium. So that is the point where, when your body is um, breaking down um, what you're eating for energy, or what it's breaking down something in your body that's stored for energy, lactate is produced. And so when I say equilibrium, that means that our body is producing lactate at the same level that it can actually use it or clear it. So this is when we have peak fat oxidation. Our mitochondria are working at their highest sustainable level without being overwhelmed. So we're really nicely in balance. And all those things are really good and are all really important for health, for improving in our sports and things like that. We're able to kind of drive all these important biological machinery, if you will, in our body to its maximum productive capacity. It's not about a heart rate. Now, what you see on your heart rate monitor could be a representation of that, but it's not a specific number and it's not a specific range. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing because people want to target. Well, how do I know that I'm in zone two if I don't have a number to follow? I want to kind of backtrack a little bit and I want to ask people to think about heart rate and the things that can influence your heart rate. How well did you sleep last night? How hot is it outside? How hydrated are you? If you're a woman, where are you at in your menstrual cycle? Before you went out for your hike, did your kid say something to you or do something that irritated or annoyed you and you're carrying some frustration into the workout? All those things have the capacity to increase your heart rate without even moving. So if you're having a day where your heart rate is influenced by these particular things and you're trying to target a particular number or a range of numbers, it might not accurately reflect how hard you're actually working. And so rather than focusing on a number, I would like to encourage people to think about this metabolic state. What we're trying to think about is staying in an aerobic state and a state of equilibrium. So we want our body to work within that state. That means it should feel pretty comfortable as we're moving about. If we think about kind of zone one, that's maybe like a dog walk, something like that. Definitely below the ceiling of zone two. When we think about the upper end of zone two, that's still pretty comfortable, still conversational, but maybe we'd need to take some breaks in our speech, right? We'd maybe say a sentence or so, take a little breath, and we can keep on going. This is the way that we can train to stress this system without destabilizing it. And so that is our target. It's an adaptation target. It's not a heart rate, if that makes sense.
So essentially, if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that rather than us believing that watching our wearable, paying attention to our watch, and trying to target a very specific range of numbers, right? Let's call it between 135 and 155.
Mhm.
You're it's you're trying to instead you could conceivably go based off of how you feel, because what you're trying to accomplish is you're trying to be in this state in which your body is clearing the byproducts of metabolism without slowing you down, right? Without feeling that excess burn that has a very limited time frame to it until you have to stop. And you could conceivably do that going based off of how you feel, as opposed to it always being within this specific range, because that range has so much variability in it. Is that
Yeah,
right? For the
absolutely,
most part.
absolutely. Yeah. So think about the fact that the heart rate is a representation of that metabolic state, and that metabolic state can reflect a little bit differently on a different day, right? So what I encourage people to do is to tune into your body. We spend a lot of time disconnecting our brains from our bodies, especially people coming from high impact sports, high intensity sports, competitive sports, right? Just work hard, turn off your brain, don't listen to the signals, go ahead. So what I encourage people to do is tune into your body so that you can learn to understand what does an effort truly feel like, what does a moderate effort truly feel like, what's a hard effort truly feel like. So if we think about zone 2, that should be fairly comfortable. Understand that those numbers might shift a little bit, each day based on those some of those factors that I mentioned. So calibrate your effort and calibrate your effort with a talk test, for example. So you could go out and run, ruck, whatever you're doing. Talk to your buddy, talk to the trees or your dog if you're out on your own, and see how many words you can say before you need to take a breath. If you can only get 4 to 5 words out before you need to take a breath, that's not zone 2. So that's a really easy way to say, like, I need to simmer down, right? I need to slow down. If you then try it again in another 5, 10 minutes and you try the talk test and you can say a couple of sentences before you need to take a breath, then that's probably where you're at. Then take a look at your heart rate, see what it's doing. Or better yet, challenge yourself to go out to do something for an hour and aim to keep yourself in at that same sort of zone 2 effort. Do the talk test throughout. Don't look at your watch. At the end of the workout, look at your heart rate and look to see what it did over the course of the workout. And then to see whether did the heart rate stay pretty stable? Did it jump all over the place because you were, constantly drifting harder, which happens to most people? You have to be pretty conscious about keeping within a particular effort. And I think that can be really helpful to calibrate things and understand what's happening. And again, remember that it doesn't have to be the same each day. Think about the other factors that are going to potentially influence your heart rate on that given day to make sure that it makes sense. Um, Also understand that if you have a sense of what your zone two sort of training range might look like for you, that might change through the seasons, right? If it's hotter, it's going to be different. If it's cooler, it's going to be different. It might change based on your sport modality. Not going to be the same if you're on a mountain bike versus running versus walking versus rucking. It's not going to be the same at different altitudes either. So that's why calibrating with a talk test is important, because you can always check in with yourself regardless of where you are, it's always going to be true in the moment. And then you can look back and see how that performed.
So could we say, and can it be true, that it would almost be better to, like, it could almost be better to buy a heart rate monitor, buy a wearable, go based off of you how you feel, and then use that data, look at that data after the workout's over to see where your heart rate range was, as opposed to where most people are doing the opposite. They are in the middle of the workout using that heart rate range to drive their workouts. They could be totally smoked and see they're in quote zone one, according to Garmin,
Mhm.
trying to push over that, be in what you call the gray zone, which is like, I love the phrase that you put to this, which is, that gray zone being not hard enough to be effective, but too hard to be effective also. So
Right.
we could conceivably say, okay, it's better to use it as an observational data as opposed to a driver.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's helpful information to have. And, think about the data that we collect. We have two types of data we collect. We have objective data and we have subjective data. So let's use all the data that we have, right? So the subjective data is how you feel in the moment. And then look back to see how did that relate to the data that your watch has been collecting. And so I think that's really quite helpful for people because we're going to show up differently on any given day, right? Based on these other circumstances that are happening. So being able to calibrate your effort by using something like a talk test is really helpful because a lot of people don't know the true difference between truly easy, moderate, and truly hard. If we took 20 people and we put them on a track and we said, "All right, everybody, go run comfortably," everyone's going to drift to that gray zone, medium hard. If you do drift in outside of that, that zone, is it going to be catastrophic? So to your point, Kyle, someone's saying like, well, oh gosh, my goal was to stay under 140 and I noticed my average was 143. My workout is out the window, right? Garbage. No, your body doesn't work that way. There's no on and off switch. There is a range. I want you to think about the fact that, when we're working to improve our aerobic system, we can influence it in two ways. We can work from the bottom up, right? So from low intensity work is going to push that ceiling up a little bit. But also, if we're working from the top and we're improving the top, like VO2 max, then that's also going to give you a little bit more bandwidth in your aerobic capacity. So we can, drifting out a little bit is fine. But what you don't want to do is spend too much time in that specific gray zone. Make sure that you have an intention before every workout. If the intention is lower intensity, zone one, zone two work, do your best to stay there. If you drift out because there's a climb or something like that, that's okay. If you drift out of range because it's getting hotter and you're a little bit dehydrated, you're slowing yourself down, you're moving pretty slowly and your heart rate's still pretty high, not catastrophic, you're still managing your effort, right? So the effort is always going to be the truth teller here.
What what is the value of, in your mind, what is or is there a value in being on the more conservative end of things than the more aggressive end of things? Because I think in the minds of most people, the fear is that if they are feeling particularly burnt, either because the training volume has continued to grow, or there's one of these outside variables you're describing because of heat, or because of a stressful comment from someone before you left, or because of altitude, or because of any of these things. I think the fear is that, okay, I've worked my tail off to create the time to go do this training. And if it's not hard enough, in other words, if I'm not relying on the more aggressive end of things, then it's wasted time. I've wasted the whole day. I've wasted my training block. I've wasted, etc. Is there, in your opinion, is there a nugget that we could hold that would suggest you're probably better off to be more on the conservative end, and if you're feeling smoke, but Garmin's telling you you're in zone one, you're better off to slow down than to try to push it into zone two and stretch?
Yeah, that's a really great distinction. And I think that's going to be a little bit different for each person. Like What's their training background? What are they training for? How far away are they from their objective? What did the training look like last week? What other stuff is going on in their life? I think the one truthful thing to do before you start any workout is we're training with intention. We're not just willy-nilly, right? So if you're going to be paying attention to your heart rate, you're coming at it with some intention. But I want you to also have a reality check, right? So before every workout, I ask athletes often, like, remind yourself, what's the intention of today's work? The intention of today's workout is a zone two workout. Great. How am I feeling? Am I prepared for this? Am I fueled? Am I hydrated? Do I have the stuff that I need to go out and do this workout? How am I feeling about it? I'm feeling great. I'm feeling ready. If you feel like you're not ready, whether you are not fueled or hydrated, fix that before you get out the door, first of all. If you're feeling mentally kind of fried, then start slowly and see what happens, right? Stay curious about it. So go into your warm up, take it easy. And maybe if you're used to doing a 15-minute warm up, maybe plan to do 20, 30, see how you feel then. Check back in. If you still feel pretty tired, your legs are not moving, you're not feeling particularly great, and you've done all the things to be prepared for the workout, then maybe what your body actually needs is a rest, a bit of a break. Turn around, come home. You've gotten 40 minutes in, right? No harm, no foul. Start again the next day, but then think about, what does your body actually need? Go to bed a little earlier that night. Make sure you're eating well that day. Clear up any stuff that's getting in your brain so that tomorrow you can come to the workout and you can execute the way you're meant to. Because sometimes pushing through might be worth it, but oftentimes we're digging a hole that's going to take a really long time to get out of.
I think one of the best things that I personally have learned over the years in my own training is to be flexible. If I have Tuesday written as a tempo or a very hard day, but I'm just, because of whatever reason, I can clearly tell that this is going to be really, really tough to do in any sort of intentional manner without just smoking myself. I'll push it off until I feel better, as opposed to, before that, I was married to the plan. Tuesday is tempo day and it will be tempo day. But the flexibility has been extremely helpful in that sense, and coincidentally left me less tired and less injured
Yeah,
by
imagine
trying to
that,
follow
right?
that. Yeah. You state this perfect in your article. You say, training, I think the verbiage in particular really paints a good picture. Training within zone 2 stresses the system without destabilizing it, and that's the adaptation target, not the heart rate. It just paints a great picture of you're aiming for this overall state as opposed to these very specific beats per minute. And if you fall outside of that beats per minute, now your workout is wasted on either side, as opposed to just targeting the state that you get, that, a little bit of added stress without the destabilization of it going into, you know, what we would probably call overtraining or what have you. I want to go
Right.
into the second part that you go into the article, which is this idea of zone 2 being low intensity, which then always ends up down the rabbit hole of being fat being burned as fuel, right? This idea of fat being used as
Yeah.
fuel. And I think there is a giant I think I don't think people really know what that means. And you do a great job. I think you're right. We did a podcast on this recently and basically made the same point. In the minds of most people, they are either thinking that is a dietary fat consumed in the moment, or body fat off of our waistline, our hips, etc. And so you go through and you make 2 points in the article. One of them talking specifically about this idea of the use of fat as fuel becoming even greater if you train fasted. So I want to get your opinions on why that is or isn't true. And then the second part is where this fuel comes from. And you make the great point that most people think that that fat's coming off of your hips or your waistline, and that's what's being used, and whether that's true or not. So let's start with the idea of being fasted, putting you in a better state than someone else who's not fasted, why that is or isn't true.
Oh yeah, this is a big one. Um, and I'm sure you come across this a lot in your work in particular. First of all, the logic sounds reasonable, right? Like, oh, well, my body's burning fat, so it's gonna, sorry, I'm gonna close the door. My dog's getting a little rambunctious. Um, it seems logical, right? If I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna be doing some low intensity work, I'm gonna be burning fat for fuel. That's gonna get rid of this fat around my stomach. If only that would have happened. And surely, if you don't eat anything, your body's gonna be forced to burn that fat, and now it's gonna be more effective, right? And the truth is that your the fat oxidation in your body that's happening when we are working at zone two, that's driven by your metabolic state, not by what you ate. So let's get that out of the way. So you don't, so it's, we talked about the intention behind your workout, paying attention to, how do you make sure you're sort of staying within zone two so that your body is predominantly using fat for fuel. It's using your stored fat for fuel, but we don't know where it's going to come from. It could come from anywhere. So that's not what we're going to be looking at. Body composition changes are typically driven by your overall energy balance over time, not by what fuel your body's using for your workout. So I think that's kind of a key thing to take away. When you're doing aerobic work, particularly zone one and zone two work, your body is learning to be really effective at using your stored fat for fuel. You're going to get that adaptation through your training. It's not going to be enhanced by starving yourself. In fact, it's going to be worse. You're going to go out and do your workout, and you're going to be potentially more tired. You're going to be potentially slower. You're going to be potentially hungrier later on in the day. So do your workouts properly fueled so that you can get the most out of the time. We are all busy people. So don't waste your time doing a workout when you're going to be hungry, tired, grumpy, obsessed with what your next meal is. And that's not going to help you. So I hope that helps dispel that myth a little bit.
I think it does. So if the fat so if the body is using fat as fuel as lower intensities at lower intensities, if it's not coming off of our hips, where or waist or stored body fat, what's being used?
In during fat oxidation, you mean
Yeah.
when we're doing aerobic exercise?
Yeah.
So we can store, so if you think about like maybe a good analogy for this is thinking about anyone who's ever run a marathon or have a marathon runner in their life, and they think about carb loading, right? So they want a carb load before the big activity. Well, we can only store so many carbohydrates in our body. So carb loading can only take us so far. But fat, we have an unlimited amount of fat throughout our body that is stored. And that is what our body is going to access for fuel. The problem with people that are, let's say, doing a lot of fasted training, their body could be using this stored fat for fuel, which is coming from, wherever it's coming within the cells in the body. Or if they are a pretty lean person, it could also be coming from muscle being broken down. And I think that's another danger. You're working really hard to keep your body fit and keep your body strong. Probably a lot of these folks are also doing a lot of strength training. And if you are not fueled properly, you don't get to choose where your body is pulling that energy from. Your body is going to go to the path of least resistance, right? So if fat is the easiest source, it's going to draw from fat. If carbohydrates are the easiest source, it's going to draw from there. And when I say easiest source, it's also going to be intensity dependent. The faster we're going, the more we're reliant on carbohydrates for fuel. If there's really no easy path, or there's not really much available, then the body is going to go towards breaking down muscle. And so that's where we want to really be careful, because that's not very helpful. So the fat that it's taking is coming from your bloodstream, it's coming from the fat stores in your in your body, and that could also come from within your muscles. There's also intramuscular fat that they could be pulling from. So don't think about it as a way to kind of melt fat off your body. It's an internal system that is happening. And will it contribute to body composition? More than likely, but there's no targeted approach to say that the fat's going to only come from your hips or your butt or your gut.
Yeah, you do a great job in the article itself, sort of highlighting, and this was the point we made in the podcast too, is that there is not a switch. It is a continuum of fuel use, right? And so your body is
Mhm.
alternating between, like, if you were to graph out 100%, there's always a distribution of the amount of fat that's being used versus carbohydrate. And as you said, as the intensity climbs, that tends to favor a higher percentage of carbohydrates versus a higher percentage of fat. But there's always the use of both. And so, the point that we were making in there as well was, dietary fat from the point that you consume it to the point that it becomes usable fuel is a very, very long and arduous process because it has to go through the entire transport chain to become fuel, to become stored in the muscle cell itself, and then to be broken down and to be used, whereas carbohydrate metabolism happens quite a bit quicker. It's been interesting to me over the years to see some of the research that comes out because you're right. When you go fasted or when you're not taking insufficient fuel, particularly on long training sessions, then you start to use protein. So it's been interesting to see some of the studies that have come out where they've tested people who fuel at certain degrees. Let's call it like a low amount of fueling, a moderate amount of fueling, or a high amount of fueling. And they tie more objective metrics to that. But I think that's one that people can relate to. And then they'll measure markers of muscle damage in the actual muscle itself after they get done with what generally was like a 26K race with about 13,000 feet of climbing in it. And they tend to find that the people who fueled the most had the least amount of muscle damage during these training sessions. And so I think that, the point there that you made in the article that was so good is that although it sounds really great to be training at low intensities and to have this endless source of fuel, it's a much more complicated matter than just drinking olive oil or hoping your hips melt away in the process. Because if you try to train fasted, or if you're using, endurance sports to become, as a method to weight loss, your performance will be in the gutter. And so you have to sort of, like, you said the word perfect when you were talking about what's the best thing to do whenever you're looking at your training schedule? You said be intentional. And I think that's the same with the fueling too, is, don't look at these as they sit on the surface. They are much more deeper, complex problems than that. And being intentional with your fueling when you're out there is going to yield the best performance. And, going from that standpoint, as opposed to, as you also say, as you can tell, I'm a fanboy of yours, outsourcing your brain to the data, the literature, Garmin, etc. I've become less and less of a fan of Garmin and wearables as a whole, just because and Strava, because like it is it is everything you say, right? It's just this almost like this you're almost married to this device that doesn't have any clue who you are or what you're dealing with, as opposed to going how you feel. Now, I've made the argument over the years, and I still think it's true, that while using Garmin in the early days, I was able to couple how I felt at a certain heart rate, and that gave me a better feel to say, you know what, forget the wearables. Like, I'm gonna go way more off of how I feel as opposed to what Garmin is telling me. And, like we were talking about earlier, using that data in retrospect as opposed to driving my decisions in the moment. Um, but yeah, I just think that those articles that you put out were so good, and wanted to be sure that we talked about them.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I really try to work on with people that I coach is learning to trust your body and listen to your body. We spend so many years, shutting the connection off. And particularly as we get older, we can't do that anymore. We can get away with a lot of dumb stuff when we're in our 20s, arguably even into our 30s. But once we hit our 40s, I'm in my 50s now, that's a lot less forgiving.
Yeah.
And so you have to learn to understand the body you're in now, not the body you had when you were 25. Understand the body that you're in now and develop a trusting relationship with it. And you can't data collect your way out of a trust problem. So the
Yeah.
data is helpful, but also it's helpful to correlate that with how you feel, what's going on, what's the terrain you're on, and what is the goal of your, your training phase and the individual workout that you're about to go and do.
Yeah, I would say that's 100% true. Now that I'm hitting 40, I can, people would say, once you hit 40, you're going to notice. And I just thought, yeah, you fools just don't know what you're doing. I do everything right, right? With my nutrition and whatever. And that's not true. I mean, when I hit 40, I noticed I had to pay much closer attention um, to what I was doing. I couldn't get by with the stupid things anymore. I couldn't sleep 4 hours multiple nights in a row and expect that by like day five I was going to be fine. I could in my 20s and 30s, but that has certainly changed. One thing that you said that I loved in one of your articles is what matters the most is not knowing matters the most is not all of the data. It's knowing the differences between the easy, moderate, and the hard. And then as you go on to say too, like going off of feel or rating of perceived exertion, the breath test, etc., using that to make adjustments as opposed to being driven by some of these numbers, I think is great.
Mhm. Yeah, don't be a slave to your watch. That's
Yeah.
the big takeaway. Like the watch is important. The watch gives you helpful information. Sometimes it can be a bully. It's telling me I'm in a recovery status right now and my training load is pretty high at the moment. So, it's not always truthful. So like, you know, do your best to not lie to yourself on top of the watch potentially lying to you or giving you some bad information.
I'm gonna leave with this and then let you kind of give some parting shots. But several years ago, you and I did some coaching together when I was training for something, and in the final weeks of training, you said something to me which lines up with one of the statements you made here, which what you said to me was, don't get stupid, don't get sick, and don't get injured. And one of the things that you put in your article here is the question isn't what to add to our training, it's what to do to not screw up. If there were any major screw ups or simple things that we could just do on a week to week basis to prevent that, what are three basics that if we did most days of the week, we're not going to screw up getting ready for something?
It's going to be what I call the unsexy basics. And that is get good, proper sleep, fuel for your adventures. So your daily nutrition matters, your nutrition during your workouts matters, and to prioritize recovery, less stress balance. If you do those things right, the other stuff should come along pretty awesomely.
We're all about the unsexy basics here. So
That's
that's
right.
great.
Should we get t-shirts?
I think we should. That would be great. Mm.
Bumper
Any
stickers.
any parting shots you want to leave people with? Any last
Yeah, I mean,
comments,
there's
last thoughts?
oof, I mean, so many things. I think, there's one big thing maybe to take away and one theme that I see when I look at like the articles now that I'm personally writing, what are the ones that are hitting hardest for people and that seem to be being the most popular or even looking at the all the content we put out at Uphill Athlete, the things that seem to be the most popular with people that get the most hits, it's always that one thing. It's a podcast on muscular endurance. It's a podcast on zone 2. It's a it's an article about a specific workout. People often looking for the one thing that's going to change everything. And there isn't one thing. Or if there is one thing, it's consistency. Have a plan, be consistent with it. Be I like to say 80% consistent 100% of the time going to take you a long way. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to look shiny or sexy. It might not get you any extra kudos on Strava, but it's going to get you to whatever your finish line is. Just, be smart about it.
I love it. The unsexy basics.
Unsexy basic style, it's all it is.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for making the time. Thanks, as always, for sharing the knowledge. And I will post everything Apple Podcast will let me post as far as the links with stuff that you have that I'm a fan of, and we'll let people check them out.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate your time today. It was fun.
I want to give a big thanks to Chantelle for joining me, sharing her knowledge. It's always a joy to chat with her. Her and I send emails and messages back and forth to each other throughout the year when something nerdy and sciencey catches our eye. And I think she has great information, and she's got a lot of experience in coaching people on the training side of things. And so it's always really fun to have her on. And I've said this probably more times than I need to, but if you're interested in checking out any of the other episodes that we've done together or the articles that she and I talked quite a bit about, you can go back down to the show notes, see all of those linked there, and check them out. We appreciate you joining us every week. And as always, if you have questions that you want us to cover in any of these episodes, you can email those to us, info@v2pnutrition.com, and we would be more than happy to answer those. And last but not least, if you get a chance, go down. You can rank the show if you've not done so before, or if you think this episode was something that a friend of yours might enjoy, you could send that over to them. We obviously don't advertise at all, and so little things like that help us a ton to kind of spread the word and just to get good information into the hands of those people that are looking for them. So thank you as always, and if you have any questions, send them over. If not, we'll talk to you again in another couple of weeks. Have a great week, everyone.